welcome to part 2 of our mentor skill building workshop. Some of you would have attended last week and might have listened to the podcast or watched the YouTube video. Don't worry if you haven't. This is pretty much also a standalone module. But I'll start off with a couple of teasers from the last one, and just to remind those of us that attended the first one. So the way we structured, or the way I've approached this particular mentor skill building workshop, is based on the work of a man called James Leach, who is a literature professor in America at one of the big colleges there. And he's gone and done a lot of all the hard donkey work of going through all the evidence and all the science around teaching and mentoring, and looking at just practical tips and ideas that can sort of up your level of mentoring and teaching. So it's a little bit the science and the toolkit you can use when you're busy mentoring, whether it be interns or students or colleagues or whatever scenario you might be in. So in our part 1, we actually looked at 2 of the main domains, and I've been using his structure. So he looks at 3 big areas of learning. The first is that boring bulk knowledge, making sure our students just know their guidelines, for one. The second part is what he calls understanding, a little bit wider than the Bloom's definition. So that's looking at the whole aspect of how you help people connect the dots and actually create a deeper understanding and application of that knowledge. And then the domain we're going to be looking at today is specifically inspiration. And I'm going to be embedding it in a little bit of our neuroscience around inspiration and motivation. And then just like last time, when we do look at inspiration as a domain, we're going to look within the bedside mentoring scenario, we're going to look within the classroom teaching scenario, and we're going to look within online platforms. So that will go through all of that. So for those of you that were in the last session, please get ready to put something in the chat for me. So we talked about those 3 domains. So the knowledge domain we talked about through last time, we looked at 3 top areas or key skills or key toolkits that we can use when we're trying to help our students just get that knowledge down, make sure they know their guidelines, make sure they know which major drug interactions they need to know about, major adverse events they need to be aware. There's certain bulk knowledge you just need to know. And I would love it if people could just see if you can remember 1, 2, or maybe all 3 of the knowledge domain areas. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat here and see if you can put them in the chat there for us. Anybody that attended last week and can remember. Ooh, it's very quiet. Slow chat, slow typers, or you're all brand new tonight? So this is also the exercise we're just doing now is actually one of the domain. There we go. Thanks, Victor. You are excused. So what I've just done is actually one of the 3 ways in which we help people to learn information. So the first one we looked at was predicting. So that's the good old fashioned pre-test, getting people to guess on something they don't necessarily know and helping to prime them. There we go. I've got one interleaving there as well. Great, thank you. So predicting is one of them. So you can give somebody, so ask them something and you warn them that you know they don't know, but by guessing or trying to imagine what the answer might be, primes them for learning. We've just done retrieval now, so forcing you to try and remember what we did last time will also help to embed that information. And the other one was interleaving. So that's spacing out information over time, coming back to information, doing some of it, bringing some of it back in the future. And I think we do that quite naturally in medicine. And then the second domain we looked at last time was understanding and how we improve understanding. Can anybody remember, if there was anybody on the call, at least 1, 2, or 3? There we go. We've got some people remembering retrieving. Well done. Can any of you remember some of our things that can help our students understand? There we go. Excellent. I've got practicing. Well done. Any of the other 2? Great. Excellent. I'm not going to torture you too much. So the one thing we looked at is ways to help people connect the dots between different bits of information. So how do we build those rich neural networks of connecting different islands of knowledge that they might have built up over the time, and how do we create the frameworks for that? We also looked at helping to teach students practice correctly. So quite often we do tell them to go and practice knowledge or learn knowledge, or especially practicing skills, but actually they practice the skills incorrectly. So how do we teach mindful practicing? And then a very useful skill, one of my favorite ones, is explaining, getting people to explain a certain skill. And I really like the one where you explain while you're busy doing something. So if somebody's busy learning how to do a lumbar puncture, get them to explain what they're doing whilst they're doing the lumbar puncture. And that actually helps calm them down, focus, learn the skill better, and get more insight in actually how and what they are doing. So that's a very quick overview of last week. For a lot more detail and lots of examples on all of those 6 different practices, feel free to check out my YouTube video or the podcast. But what we want to do today is specifically looking at inspiration, and I'm going to start on a slightly different tack. And some of you that might have attended some of my sessions before on burnout and some of my sessions on what they used to call the difficult patient, what we now call it the patient who is difficult, to look at some of the neuroscience between challenging mentoring relationships. Because quite often I realize when we talk about becoming better mentors or improving our mentoring skills, quite often what we're focusing on is actually the mentors, the mentees that are struggling. So if you have a mentee that's already really inspired, loves being in rural medicine, loves being out there learning new things, is interested in his patients, want to become a better doctor, that doctor almost doesn't need mentoring. He needs to have a little soundboard of who he can call when he needs advice, but he or her will actually do most of their learning by themselves, and they will make the effort to find out what they need to know. The difficulty is when you are a clinical manager in a hospital, or you're a lecturer in a varsity and you have a student or an intern or a community service doctor or a clinician in rehab, and that person, the relationship's not going well. They're coming late for work. They're perhaps struggling with some of their communication skills with patients. They're terrible when they present a case over the phone. So you have those scenarios where things are not going so well. Sometimes you need to ask yourself, why does it have to be so hard? Why does this have to be so complicated? They know what they need to do. Why are they simply just not doing it? And so let's kind of take a little bit of a step back and ask the question, why are people sometimes difficult? And of course, the answer is very simple, but we're going to unpack it now. It's because they're stressed. And this is not just, we love to use the word stress so loosely, but I'm going to look specifically at how stress changes us neuroscientifically, neurophysiologically, and what this means. So now I'll first start with basic stuff. This right? So we all live all the time in one of 2 modes. There's obviously a spectrum, but they're pretty much a polarity. So either our sympathetic system is in full kick, so that I'm going to call survival mode, or we have our parasympathetic system predominant, and that I'm going to call creative mode. And when our patients have panic attacks or anxiety, we're very good at explaining to them about these 2 modes, don't we? And we explain to them that when they feel threatened, they make lots of adrenaline, their body goes into a sympathetic state, and then you all know we get increased heart rate and respiratory rate, we get a sweaty periphery, we get a slowed down metabolism. When we switch off the adrenaline, get home after a busy day at work, put our feet up and we relax, then our blood pressure and pulse can calm back down, our muscular system can relax, we can have full metabolic function. So this we're very aware of, and we often talk to our patients, hopefully, about this dynamic. What we forget is how dramatic that particular switch also affects the way the brain functions. So when your body switches on that adrenaline switch, literally most of the circulation or most of the activity in your neurological system is going to be sitting around your limbic brain, around what we call the primitive brain or the animal brain. And the purpose of that brain is survival. So it has a very particular thinking modality to try and get itself out of a tight spot. So it's very quick thinking, it's very focused on cause and effect, and its whole purpose is just to survive and bring down its anxiety. When the limbic system is not in charge, so when we are in our parasympathetic state and we're relaxed, then the prefrontal cortex actually takes most of the activity, and that becomes the lead. And now the prefrontal cortex has got a completely different modus operandi than the limbic system. So this is where our meaning and purpose in our lives lie. This is where we ask the great questions. What is things about? What is important to me? Where's my higher values? And the thinking here is very different because we now have access to a whole higher level of thinking. We can think laterally, we can think in a much better perspective. Here we're able to be empathic, and here we're able to be creative. This sounds perfectly obvious, but most of us are not very good at differentiating when we are in survival mode and when we are in creative mode. And quite often we identify too strongly with what we are experiencing when we are in survival mode. So the switch, of course, to get from stress mode to creative mode, or get from creative mode to stress mode rather, is adrenaline. So whenever we feel fearful, the adrenaline switch goes, and we're going to go more into a limbic system survival state. And the underlying thing is, the underlying experience is, I am not safe. And when I am not safe, my adrenaline is up and my functioning changes, my thinking changes. So this level of safety can happen on different levels. So when I mean by safe, you all remember the good old-fashioned Maslow triangle, you know, those different levels of needs and actualization, and we can actually group them into three major groups. Most importantly, of course, is a need to be bodily safe. So that includes financial safety, and that also includes our health. So you can already think in terms of our patients. When you arrive at a hospital level and you have symptoms you don't know or understand, or you're feeling physically unwell, you're already feeling bodily unsafe. But we also need to be safe emotionally. This we also have well, similar to the animal kingdom. We have a need to be loved and to be part of something. We need to feel we're included in something, that we are not abandoned by those around us, that we are cared for by those around us. And if we don't feel safe emotionally, if we feel somehow sidelined or pushed away or rejected or criticized or shouted at, we do not feel safe. And then we have a third level, which is interesting, and this is very specific around human, is our need to be independent and to have freedom of choice, a need to be able to live our lives and makes the choices that we want for our lives. And in very topical at the moment, issues around gender identification, for example, sexual preferences, we need to be able to have the choices of how we want to relate with the world. And when that freedoms get curtailed, that can also make us feel unsafe. So three basic levels. And I think a lot of us hopefully are mostly bodily safe. You might have the odd, into highway experience. But generally, most of us find our challenges around these next two levels, feeling safe emotionally or feeling curtailed in our freedom of expression. So I'm now going to be leaning on an amazing book written by Prof. Steve Peters. For those of you who like nice analogies, I love giving my patients lots of stories and analogies and metaphors. He wrote a book called The Chimp Paradox. He calls it about mind management, very much written from a psychiatric point of view. And he describes this limbic brain, this animal part of ourselves, as a dear, adorable, lovable chimp. And it's a lovely analogy to have. We have this chimp part of ourselves. That is the part that interacts with the world. That's where all our joy and our fun lies. But that's also where our survival mechanism lies. And in the world of the limbic brain, where lives all our instincts. So our fight, flight, and freeze response lives there similar to animals. So when we feel threatened, we either try and fight the threat, or we flee the threat, or we somehow try and freeze and manage the situation like that. Or we have very specific drives that belong to that part of us. So sex, obviously, dominance, food is an important drive. Those of you who ever go to lunchtime and OPD is very busy. Security, feeling safe in our environment, feeling territory, what belongs to me, what belongs to somebody else. And then finally, our troop, family, community. These are very primeval drives that we all experience to some extent. And when they feel threatened, or when they feel impinged upon, this chimp can feel unsafe and can create that adrenaline rush. On the other hand, we have that prefrontal cortex, and I love the term here called the sage. That's by Shazad Tamim. We'll speak a bit more about him in a bit. And the prefrontal cortex has got a completely different drive. So this is where all our powerful ethic and moral drives live. So it's a very different world than our limbic brain. And it's a part of us that's developed much later in evolution. And it's here that we have the possibility of compassion. It's here where what we call the conscience lies. Here's where we decide we'll follow the rules because it's good for the community. So the chimp doesn't like wearing masks, but the sage will decide masks is a sensible thing to do. We won't talk about vaccinations here quite yet. Honesty, integrity, all qualities of that prefrontal lobe. This is our ability to have self-control, so delayed gratification. Our limbic chimp brain wants things now. Think of any 2-year-old, very good example of little cute chimps. But now we're able to say, no, hold on, I'm going to leave this now and I'll leave it for later. And this is where we're able to be tolerant, flexible, and understanding of others. So now you're able to step into somebody else's shoes, see somebody else's point of view. So very important is to understand that our quality of thinking and our decision-making gets influenced depending on which mode we are at. And all of us, this happens to every single person. And so you can have highly intelligent, highly loving, compassionate people, sometimes behaving not quite in the way you would expect because they are in an unsafe space and because that adrenaline level is too high. So the survival brain thinking very much relies on assumptions. So it has to think quite quickly, and so it guesses and it makes up stuff. This is our basic basis for all our biases lies within the survival brain thinking, and narrative bias very strongly here. So you've got a little bit of information and then you make up a whole story to try and make sense of it. It's very unstable and it's inconsistent. It tends to go with whatever emotionally tends to happen at the time. Look at any social media feed. Jumps to an opinion and a conclusion very, very quickly. So confirmation bias, classic chimp activity. Thinks very much in black and white. Things are either right or other things are either wrong. It tends to be paranoid and overvigilant. So there's a negative bias in the survival brain. It obviously has to anticipate problems. So it always sees the problems before it even happens. And it has this word, emotive judgment. Oh, and we're feeling a lot of emotive judgment on social media at the moment. It judges quickly and without mercy. So there's a us and them quality that comes in when you're in survival brain mode. And of course, when you're in survival mode, you're very selfish because you're only thinking in terms of your own survival at that point in time. When we go to creative mode, it's in contrast. So now remember your adrenaline is off, same person, right? Adrenaline is off, you're now relaxed, you're finally able to think things through properly. And now you're interested in what are the actual facts? What are the truths? Let's not make assumptions here. You use a logical base for your thinking and your acting. This is where we find evidence-based rational thinking is happening on this side. And I think in medicine, we are so terrified of chimp thinking that we've invented the randomized controlled double-blind study because the chimp is what makes our data potentially risky if we don't make sure we've got very clear rules to keep that at bay. It has to be in context, our thinking, and with perspective. You're now suddenly able to see the other person's view. When you're in survival mode, for example, when you're running away from a lion, you're not going to be thinking about shame, poor lion, must be hungry, probably struggling, we must be good to the environment. At that moment, you can't think out of your own perspective. But in creative mode, we can see the bigger picture. And here we have all those shades of grays. We can make a balanced judgment. We understand that nothing is black and white. We can understand the different pros and cons. We can do a risk-benefit analysis. All our empathy lies here. Creativity, innovation. And then I love this word. This is from Brene Brown, where she talks about being generous in our assumptions. And I think if we lived in a world where we were all a little bit more generous about other people, it would be a different place indeed. Because a lot of us have times when we are in chimp mode or in survival brain mode for whatever reason, and we behave in ways that not always in line with our best selves. And it would be lovely if people were a little bit generous in our assumptions. And so that's the one line I want you to take away with you when you're looking after your mentees. If you have a mentee that is difficult, that seems to make things hard, that does not seem to be learning or coming to the party or not a team player, or for some reason makes things so hard, is to start being understanding they're probably in survival brain thinking, they're probably not safe, and to be generous in our assumptions of those people. And that means we will treat them very differently. And hopefully we'll get a bit of generosity in return every now and then. So if you think of the brain as a consciousness car that's taking us through life, the chimp is actually always in the driving seat. So our survival brain is the the place with which we manage the world around us. So all the information, all our sensory information first goes through our survival brain. And what this chimp does is it literally is screening the environment. If everything is safe, then it can go quickly, nicely onto automatic behaviors. You've all done this, drive the car to work and you can't even remember if the traffic lights were red or green. But as soon as something happens, somebody quickly cuts in front of you, it triggers that flight, fight, freeze response. And the chimp makes suggestions to this captain of the ship or this sage, this prefrontal cortex. And in the ideal world, what should be happening is the prefrontal cortex is the one that should be navigating. So although the chimp is driving, we preferably want our lives to be driven or controlled by the impulses from our prefrontal cortex. When the chimp is in charge and your sage is locked in the trunk of the car, a little MCU quote, then you have a problem. And then we have a scenario where you have somebody who is seemingly completely irrational, seemingly to make everything worse, seemingly unable to be able to be reasoned with. And at that point, they're actually in complete chimp overdrive and not able to access their higher brain function at all. So another two concepts I want to throw in there that fits with this picture is of understanding of these two different levels of consciousness. And I like to call it dual awareness, that we actually have the ability to be aware of these two parts of ourselves. So we've all had scenarios where you perhaps throw a little temper tantrum or get very upset about something, and you have a part of yourself watching yourself do this. So we all have this ability to actually notice our behavior and have one part of ourselves observing another part of ourselves. And of course, in the world of meditation and prayer and all of your personal development programs works very much with being able to cultivate this awareness and being able to understand that you have these two levels. So when you're in chimp mode, you can think of being in what I'm going to call street view. So you know also those video games where the guy's going through narrow passages and he's got his gun and he's looking for the baddies. And all you can see is literally just the little street in front of you. And when you go around the corner, you don't know what's going to happen. And when you're in chimp mode, that's literally where that person is at. They're literally only within that very small space, and all they can think about is survival. And when we talk about patients who are difficult or patients who are struggling, that's a lot of our patients actually sit in that view when they're coming into our offices. When you're coming into a prefrontal brain perspective, you're able to rise above that street view, and now you get balcony view. And with a balcony view, you're suddenly able to see the whole city out in front of you, and now you have perspective. You can see what's coming up ahead, you can see where you've been, you can understand all the factors that might be influencing things, and now you can make much better decisions about what to do about a difficult situation. So that's been like broad neurophysiology. And I'm now going to go into a little bit more detail in terms of the individual. I'm not going to spend much time on this. This is the kind of thing I would love to do a whole day workshop on. And it's more to stimulate you to read a little bit further. But it's now to start looking personally about how do you behave when you are stressed? And so also, how do different people behave? How do these chimps manifest in different people in different ways? And I think becoming more and more aware of what our own little chimps do when we're stressed makes us much more able to also manage scenarios where somebody else might be in stress mode. So here's a little self-reflection exercise. We're not going to spend much time on this, but I just want to see if you can call to mind in the last 2 weeks, preferably, a situation where you had felt stressed in a relationship. So either talking to somebody or being in a scenario with somebody, and you'd had an interaction where it was not a great interaction. It definitely could have gone better. If you have a scenario with a mentee or a student, that's great. If you don't, or there was nothing at work that happened particularly exciting, it can also be a scenario with somebody at home, a partner, a child, a parent, a friend. But when you have those scenarios where the communication was more negative than positive. So I want you just to have that in mind, because we're now going to take a little step back and look at what's happening behind that behavior to see if something pops up. So we're going to talk now about what chimps do when they get anxious. And what happens is this has come specifically from Shazad Chamin and a lovely book called Positive Intelligence. The concepts are not new. They've been around for about 100 years. But again, he's just put it into some very nice analogies and structures in terms of understanding it. And he talks about the formation of actual identities that gets created by survival mode. And these identities are typically formed during childhood. So when you're growing up as a child, you will have scenarios where you don't feel safe. So here's a very quick, the whole lecture on parenting, right? To be a good parent, you only need to do 3 things: is make your child feel safe bodily, emotionally, and on an independent level. There we go. That's parenting. Done. But of course, no parents are perfect. And even with perfect parents, we do not have a perfect world, and children misunderstand quite often what happens around them. Never mind that we have lots of scenarios where children do not feel safe when they're little, and they have no power. So the body doesn't like it when there's a lot of adrenaline in the system. And so it finds patterns of behavior that reduces its anxiety and makes it feel more in control. And those patterns of behavior does not necessarily solve the problem. It just makes you temporarily feel less anxious and more in control. And actually, a lot of those patterns are quite useful when you're physically threatened. So they've been created. Animals have also got all these particular patterns that they've created to try and deal with things that might threaten them. So that's the fight, flight, freeze. So fight, flight, freeze is quite useful if you're physically threatened. So if as a child, your father comes home drunk and you're frightened and you go and hide in the cupboard, that's probably a very sensible way of avoiding that particular threat. The problem is that a lot of these things are really stupid in relationships. So it's great in physical threats, but try and pull it on your husband and go and hide in the cupboard when you have to try and talk something out. That's not going to work. It's very selfish, so it doesn't understand the larger picture. And Shazad particularly calls them saboteurs, because what happens is we have a scenario, we feel stressed and anxious, we behave in a certain way to bring down our anxiety, and it makes everything worse. And you'll find this with mentees. So you might have somebody who is busy, a student who's busy studying, an intern, somebody's busy even specializing. You expect them to be reaching certain targets, doing certain things, and they are just not doing it. And they are struggling at work, and they're struggling in their exams, and all the stuff they do just seems to be making things worse. And all of those scenarios, you can be fairly sure that they are more in survival mode than prefrontal mode, and these saboteurs have been coming into play. So this is what I mean with a workshop, because there's actually Shazad describes 10, I have formulated them into 9. And these are all specific behaviors, and I'm going to go through them very quickly. And all I want you to do is you might pick up on at least 1 or 2 behaviors that you do and that you might have picked up in that relationship we just mentioned, that the other person might have done, that was ways of you both trying to reduce your anxiety and might have been making things worse. So the classic one, the one we all do, it's included in all of them, is criticizing. So when the limbic brain does not feel safe, when we don't feel safe for whatever reason, the go-to thing is find somebody to criticize. And there's lots to criticize if you go and look, right? So you can either criticize the other person, that usually just gets you into a big fight, or you can criticize the government, or you can criticize on what's happened before, or you can criticize the system, or you can criticize the managers, or there's a lot of things to criticize, especially in rural health settings. And usually this is the kind of criticism that's not solving the problem. So criticizing is all of us have to a lesser extent. And you can also do things like criticize yourself, and you might not criticize out loud. You might be happening in your head, but this is a way of trying to feel in control. And it's one of the fight methodologies that people use to try and cope. So other ways of fight methodologies is overanalyzing. Ooh, I like that one. There's a lot of professors who all like to overanalyze, become very analytical, but actually doing it to reduce anxiety and do not actually do it as an evidence-based methodology, or manipulating and trying to control a situation. So any of those have ever had I know control freak is the word that comes to mind for quite often for some women. And those are all just methods of where somebody is trying to control their anxiety. And then the freeze section is ways in we are not fighting and we're not fleeing, but trying to deal with, for example, fixating on details and becoming perfectionistic. We all know pleasing as a methodology that some people use to try and reduce anxiety. And then, of course, worrying, lying in bed at night, thinking things over and over again doesn't solve anything, but it vaguely makes us feel like we're under control. And then the classic ones is avoidance. So sometimes if you, depending on personality, you might distract yourself. Netflix binging, addictions all fall into this section, overworking. There's the victim, the self-pitying, oh, why me? And then the avoiding. So this is your mentees that might just not show up at work, might just not show up for your lessons. You call them when they're on call and they don't answer the phone. So these are all methodologies that in the end is going to make things worse, but is actually a way that that limbic brain is trying to reduce anxiety. So it gets interesting when you're looking at your mentees and when you are in difficult scenarios, is being able to recognize these behaviors and go and understand, be gracious in your assumptions. This person is not safe, and therefore I am not at the moment communicating with their best self. All I'm stuck with at the moment is the chimp. So we're not going to cover in detail on how you deal with chimps. That's a whole workshop in its own right, but a couple of principles. The challenge with chimp actions is it will usually elicit an even greater chimp reaction. So the best way to get somebody else's chimp up is to get your chimp in action. If you want to really practice a chimp war, get the teenagers on it, right? So there's nothing like an adolescent, because adolescents are, of course, experts on this. The prefrontal cortex only myelinizes by the time you're 21, 22. So teenagers have got some prefrontal activity, but not all of it yet, but their limbic systems are doing well. But if your teenager is in chimp mode and you as an adult react in chimp mode, that's when you start what we call arm wrestling a chimp. Never, ever, ever arm wrestle a chimp, because you will always lose. Nobody wins in any of those fights. And although it feels very tempting because your anxiety and adrenaline is going up, that's where you start getting your challenges. And this is very, very important with our mentees. So if you have a mentee who is struggling and is behaving in what feels like a difficult if somewhere you just can't understand why is like this, in those scenarios, the last thing you want to do is get your chimp to come to the party, as you're going to lose that relationship very quickly. So I've got just a general chimp awareness thing. Don't make any important decisions. So also don't have any of your discussions with your mentee or have any significant conversations. So if you're going to talk to your mentee about your lateness, you make sure you're not in chimp mode, or post anything on social media in chimp mode. So I'm going to give one example of somebody we know of chimp mode, and this is Trump. Donald Trump late at night feels very threatened by a variety of things, or in the old days, we were able to see what he did. And he would sit on Twitter and post all of his things, usually criticizing and attacking and trying to control things. And quite often he would make mistakes and contradict himself. And you would look at a very intelligent man seeming to behave very strangely late at night. And this is the risk of chimp mode, sabotaging the things that you are actually trying to achieve and the things you are actually trying to do. And I think it's just a good rule to teach all of our students. So what we've just done is we've covered very quickly to understand the neurophysiology of how stress makes us stupid. And being able to understand that makes us gracious about people when they're behaving stupidly, and also makes us not go, oh, that person is a bitch, or that person is a arsehole, or that person is stupid. It's not. They're just in chimp mode. And actually what I have found is that if you can create safety, you create the possibility for people to come out and bring out the best part of themselves, because we all have that prefrontal cortex. We all have that balcony view possibility. And how do we create a safe space that our mentees can actually explore that? That takes us straight into the practical part, which is this third domain, the inspiration domain. I really like this one because it made me think about things I haven't thought about in this way. And the first one that James Lang brings up is a lovely thing called belonging. Now, belonging theory goes about our experience of belonging within an academic environment. So interestingly enough, I mean, I grew up in a very academic world. My dad was an engineer that then went to study dentistry. My mother studied social work. My aunt was a radiologist. My uncle was an anesthetist. My cousin then studied forensic medicine. So we were that first generation of Afrikaners where everybody was going to university because that was the thing to do. But even I, when I arrived at university, slightly overawed by this huge academic institution and this huge intellectual's place of learning. Now imagine just how many of our students coming from diverse backgrounds, challenging backgrounds, or backgrounds that was just not academic. They might come from a rural background where neither of their parents have been to university, might not even have finished school. And for them, they can have a real feeling of alienation when they arrive at a huge academic institution. What am I doing here? Do I really belong here? Do I actually have anything to offer? And as for what they have shown actually is for students to be able to thrive in a university or academic setting, or to thrive within a rural health setting, which is also actually still a very to do with capacities and skills and learning, they need to have a cognitive belonging. They need to feel that they can offer something and that they have value. And they therefore talk about, it's very important to reflect on how we view our students. So there's two different ways in how we can view those new students or those new interns or those new rural doctors as they come into our facility. The one is what they call a deficit view. So you're assuming here they come, they know nothing, I'm gonna have to teach them everything, oh good grief, you know, that first. Or you can have an asset view of saying, hold on, this person is going to bring something new to my facility. They're coming with new ideas, new backgrounds, new cultures, new knowledges that can actually add to my facility. They are not just blank slates. And being able to value that our students have assets shifts the way we think about them and helps them to include them within this academic environment. So what we want students to experience is that they belong in this academic environment. And with that, I'm not just meaning university. I mean, as a medical profession or as a rehabilitation profession, as a professional profession, they belong and they have something unique to offer. So if we look at that in practice, so how do we do that? How do we create an experience of our people feeling that they belong? And in all of our programs, you can have an experience of creating opportunities for your students to, or doctors or interns, when they first arrive, to actually share their assets. So we have with our students and our interns that they fill in, you know, like their name and their demographic details and like their contact details and email address and stuff. And so what we've done is just added on the back, I've started adding some questions in terms of, so what strengths do you bring specifically to, say they're coming in as a physiotherapist, what strengths do you bring in your role as a physiotherapist, or in your role as a doctor, or in your role as a nurse? What experiences or perspectives do you bring from your particular background or where you come from? And what other talents and strengths do you have that might not be immediate medically, but also who are you? What else do you do when you're not at work? And ideally, it'll be lovely if you have the opportunity, and you might be able to do that in a rural setting. You want to sit down and actually ask people these questions. But I have found with our students that literally come on a 4-week rotation, it's like one of those rabbit wheels, that just reading all the things they've written, giving them the opportunity to write it and reading that, and then giving little bits of feedback as I run into them in the different teaching sessions, already changes my view and already makes them see that we are appreciating them as people who are bringing something unique. Now, an important thing that happens with belonging, which I've never put together in that way, is that when we feel we belong in a place, so we feel we're part of a family, so it creates safety, that normalizes help seeking. So we can create a scenario where it's normal to seek for help, to seek for support, to ask for questions. And our most successful students are the students that are able to ask for help. And we all know this. Our biggest challenges with mentees is not the mentee who doesn't know anything, because as long as they're able to ask every time they get stuck, they will be brilliant in whatever they're going to be doing. Our challenge is the mentee who never asks for help. So when you pick up the folder later and you notice, oh my goodness, that hasn't worked. So in your bedside mentoring scenario, to take a little bit of effort to get to know your mentees, make the effort when you're walking to the ward to ask those personal questions. Where are you from? You know, where do you live? Are you married? Do you have kids? And very important is to find little opportunities to affirm their specific strengths and that unique value that they bring to the facility. And quite often we have, it doesn't necessarily always have to be academic strengths, but anything that they bring that is useful, or even if it's small gestures, it's a little bit like having your kids at home and saying thank you for picking up their socks or whatever it is, because it means that we recognize that they're part of the family and we appreciate what they're doing in that family. In a classroom setting, this gets also quite interesting, is that we need to understand that when we are giving tasks to our group, so we have a group of say 10, 15 students, some of them know the academic world. They know and understand how academia works. They get it quite easily. And when you give group tasks, you might have students that don't understand it so easily. So quite often we might give a verbal instruction or a verbal task and break them up into small groups. So very important here in those scenarios is to make sure your task is very clearly written and that you double check a few times with different students that they've understood the task. So don't leave anybody behind. And then the other thing that's quite important is when you are creating groups, and we have this tendency of saying, oh, choose your own group leader or choose who's going to write on the challenge with that is you have some students who are much more comfortable with, always end up writing the notes or always end up presenting. And it might be important to sometimes assign roles. So if you're, for example, in a rural hospital setting and you've got a few new doctors that's joined, to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to contribute and to be involved in the different tasks that are happening. And this one I really like. This is something new I've learned and that I'm going to start using. So say you've got a class and you are asking questions, and especially if you want them to analyze something or to figure something out, and warn them. I don't want anybody to shout out the answer. I'm not going to take the first hand up. As soon as you think you know or you want to answer, please put up your hand. And you wait till at least 5 hands are up before you choose somebody to speak. So this gives the opportunity for the student in the class who's a little bit slower, who needs to think it through, to also feel that they can also contribute, that they can also offer an answer. So you're not always picking the one that always is quick off the mark. And that also gives you the opportunity to ask different people in the class to contribute as you go through the class session that you are doing. In the online learning, you have to be quick, get a bit good on the discussion boards. So be on your discussion boards and particularly reply to specific people and name specific good work if there are people who are bringing good contributions. So James, that was a really excellent suggestion that you did there. Or Mandisa, I really liked how you described that, or or that question that you've asked. And of course, if we have time, it is not, one can do sometimes personalized emails or actual feedback on assignments. Also a way to personally build a connection and to have that view. You have something to offer. Thanks for that. Thanks for bringing this. And before you start bringing your criticism. So some of the principles on this particular one is to emphasize the growth. We're going to talk about that some more in a minute as well. Clarify, clarify, clarify. Be very clear about your instructions. And to become quite focused when you are teaching in terms of where your different sections students are at, and to become aware of your own view. Am I viewing my student or my doctor or my intern from an asset view or from a deficit view? Am I really looking for the strengths they're bringing, or are they just another bunch that I now have to train up before I send them on their way? And the motto in this particular section is no one to be left behind. I have this memory when we first started medical school. I don't know if they did this to you. They go, look to your left, look to your right. Only one of you will still be here by the end of this, training. And there's this feeling like you have to sort of fight for survival. And once people are part of our academic community, we actually want them to feel that we embrace them, we bring them in, and we're not going to leave anybody behind. So our second domain here on inspiration is on motivating. So we've all been waiting for that one. How do we motivate students? And of course, we know that in the theory of motivating, there's intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. Sometimes people debate a lot. So intrinsic is that internal drives that we have. I want to write the HIV diploma, or I want to be really good at this, or add value, or things that is important to ourselves. And extrinsic motivators is, well, I get paid to do this job, for example, or I'm working for a specific award. And of course, we need a mix of both. So it's great to have intrinsic motivation. Quite often that's what we would love to do, is we'd like people to have intrinsic motivation, but we all have days when it's such a drag to sit down and read another paper or learn another thing. And then building in some external motivators are also very helpful. But around motivating, when we look at the theory of motivating, all you need to know about motivating is that it always is based on emotions. So if you want to motivate somebody, you have to make them feel something. Motivating, and that's why they call it emotion, It's literally something that moves you and that motivates you. And being able to capture the emotion and the attention of our students is actually the only way to bring motivation into our classes. Sometimes we spend a lot of time looking at all the information we're supposed to bring, and we don't think enough about how we're going to capture the emotion of the people that we are teaching. So we also do that. The human brain does this naturally. So emotion teaches us what is important to learn and what is not important to learn. It directs us in terms of where we are going to be learning. And the most important emotion for learning, and this is what's interesting as well, because I've not seen this research before, is actually self-transcendent purpose. So we know intrinsic motivators are even more powerful than extrinsic motivators. And we know that our own intrinsic motivation, so if I've got a motivation, I want to be the best in my class, that is already an important emotion for learning. But even more important for that is if we have a purpose that is greater than myself. So that's interesting. And it's lovely because in the world of medicine, what we do is amazing. I mean, we are making such a difference to our patients and to healthcare and to the human communities that we live in. But we sometimes forget to use that as a way to help engage our students and help them learn. Also important to obviously remember that emotions are social and contagious. So your own level of emotion is going to have a big effect on what happens in your class, and the emotions of other people in the class is going to have a big effect on what happens in the class. So there's quite often some professors will say they don't have to like me, but unfortunately it has been shown that the more your mentees like you, the better they learn. So positive emotions is very, very motivating. So in practice, some tips and ideas for that is when you do a class, we did this at the beginning of this lecture, you open with wonder or inspiration or posting an important quote on the screen. So I reminded us at the beginning of this lecture, because it's true, that to change the world, we teach. The only way to change the world is to change what people do and behave. And the only way we can do that is actually through education. So that is the larger picture of all these little things we are learning here at the moment. And when we are learning, when you're doing a lecture on diabetes, you can have some powerful stats that's not just boring stats, but powerful stats about the impact we can have if we manage, for example, diabetes well. You can also open with stories, so it's okay to tell stories. You can bring a shocking question, you can bring a statement, you can bring half a story that you finish later. So bringing those rich narratives brings emotion into your stories. And then this, what I mentioned earlier, to be able to invoke this larger purpose, reminding our students of the larger picture. And that's much easier teaching medicine than literature, I think. And then very important is to share your own enthusiasm. So if you love what you're teaching, that will also affect the way your students are learning. And then if you can, to pay attention to all your students. So creating an emotional connection with students, spending 5 minutes before class, chatting to them, arriving a little bit earlier, asking questions, and creating an emotional connection already makes a difference. And this is quite interesting. So at the beginning of our courses, whether they come to our rural hospital or whether they come to us as an intern or whether they come as a student, we give them some sort of, introductory material. And quite often that material can be quite cold, and, we all learn the school habits. And I'm just going to ask for everybody to mute their, apologies, just to mute your, mute yourselves. Chris, do you just want to mute yourself there? Thank you. Otherwise, we're going to get a little bit of interference.
Sorry.
No problem. Cool. Okay. So when you are writing your syllabus, so for example, you can write a whole paragraph about cell phones in class. If I found you with a cell phone in class, it will be taken away. Or if you are late, you will be getting this penalties, or, we expect this and this. And your language can be quite cold and quite dictatorial and quite negative in the way you phrase things. It's very possible to rewrite things. It might take a little bit more words, but to warm up the language you use in your syllabus to bring an emotion of inclusivity, of this is what we aim for. We've all noticed that social media can be really interfering in terms of learning, We have these guidelines to help us work better with how media interferes with class settings. So you can create a language where you're already making people feel emotionally connected to the material itself. So the principle of motivation, important to acknowledge the emotion in the room. And so this is where you want to make sure you're creating a safe space. So if we talked about those two different levels of sage versus chimp, you do not want to teach a class of chimps. You're not going to get anywhere. And of course, show enthusiasm, care about your material, and evoke purpose, as we've said earlier. How are we doing for time? We're doing fine. Great. So the third part and the last part of our inspiration domain that I want to talk about is a little bit more of learning. And this time is looking at learning in the realm of inspiration. And some of the theory I'd like to cover here, and I'm sure some of you might have come across this, is around what we call a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. So a lot of research has been done around two types of this, obviously lots of polarities in learning, but these are two particular mindsets we can see in the way people approach learning. And a fixed mindset is the belief that intelligence and abilities are set and that you cannot change who you are. So this is when people say, I am bad at maths, or I can't juggle, or I am terrible at languages, or I can't speak in public. So that is a very fixed idea in terms of what you can or cannot do. And of course, there's a range. So some of us might be very fixed in one area. I definitely can't juggle. I have tried, but might be much more open in terms of being able to change things and learn things. But what's interesting is that people in some areas can be somewhere between the two, and you as a teacher or a mentor can push somebody more towards a fixed mindset or more towards a growth mindset. And the way you do that is partly, and of course, if you criticize, so whenever you make somebody feel unsafe, they're going to go more into fixed mindset because that's the default protective measure, but also praise. So if you praise somebody for traits, so you are so clever, or you are so pretty, or gosh, you are so good at art, that's select for a more fixed mindset. And they did these experiments on showing primary school children in maths, and they discovered that children who were told in their first tests they were very clever did much poorer in tests later on, which was harder because they believed they should just be able to do it. So fixed mindset makes it much more difficult for us to learn, makes us much more insecure. And of course, it means that we don't seek for help as much as we should. Growth mindset obviously is this belief that intelligence is actually malleable and that any capacity can be gained through practice and hard work. And to be able to select for that, you actually want to praise for effort rather than praise for traits. So, oh my goodness, you scored very high in that exam. You have worked very hard for that. Or you practiced and practiced and practiced until you got it. So already our way we look at knowledge, so if somebody is struggling with a new surgical skill, for example, or struggling to learn a particular amount of knowledge, you can say, gosh, yeah, this is going to take quite a bit of work, but you'll definitely get there. Everybody gets there in the end. It's just, this is quite hard, or this is a lot of work. And the focus is on the belief that we get there by changing the way, by working at it. And I think the more, those of us who's been around the block a few times, I don't think you can survive if you sit with a fixed mindset, because at my age, I learn new things every single day. And you just have to get quite humble about the fact that you'll never know the whole lot, and you can continuously be surprised and learn the next thing. So the science of learning is also a constantly changing field. And so one of the big things about inspiring through learning is for you as a mentor to become inspired with the science of learning. So this is one of the big take-home messages. So we obviously want to stay up to date with our medical clinical knowledge, but I see even with my students, I teach the same topics every 4 weeks. And one can get to a point where you can go, well, I mean, we've been through this, I've been through STIs, just so, you know, syndromic treatment just stays exciting for so long. And so what can keep the material fresh and what can keep you inspired and then keep your students inspired is by you looking at different ways of teaching that material, for example, and different aspects of the science of learning. So we've looked at lots and lots of suggestions over the last 2 hours, and just being able to play and apply with different ones in different sessions keeps your teaching fresh. So in practice, try and read at least one book every month or quarter on learning or education. My favorite thing is getting audiobooks, and I listen to them in the car. I've got a 45-minute drive every day. And that's a great way to stay up to date. So this book from James Lang, I first came across via audiobook and used to listen to it on the way to work. Join our higher education podcast, online discussion forum. A lot of the universities have a student and learning center that might have interesting activities going on. And then every quarter, or whenever you feel you're getting a bit jaded with whatever you're teaching, look at a new tool or a new idea or some new suggestions on how you're going to be mentoring or teaching that particular aspect. Very important is teach others what you learn about teaching, which is what I'm doing. And that's definitely the best way to stay inspired with the topic of mentoring and guaranteeing that I'm going to be implementing some of these suggestions. So it's 2 minutes to 6. I wasn't sure how far we were going to get, so I put in the last few slides on something called appreciative inquiry, which I'm not going to cover, but I'm going to tell you about and where to find it. So this is the book I like. There's lots of books about appreciative inquiry for those of you that's not come across it. And this book by Jackie Stavros and Cherry Torres is very practical. So it's the kind of book you can read and actually learn to implement quite quickly. And the idea is that we change the world through communication, obviously, and the way we talk, everything we say can either steer a conversation in a positive, appreciative direction or in a negative, depreciative direction. And then she looks at the way that we either make statements or questions when we speak. And so they create this lovely grid of the kinds of conversations we have. And the worst kind of conversation you can have is a depreciative conversation that's inquiry-based. So these are negative questions. And these she calls destructive conversations. Why are you not taking your treatment? Do you want to die? Have you heard that one? I've heard that one. And these conversations you can just imagine how unsafe somebody feels when you have this kind of conversation. And then inquiry-based appreciative conversations are conversations where you're using positive questions to generate positive possibilities. That's it all in a nutshell. And as you can see, all that we're doing with these techniques is creating safety or creating unsafety. And so going forward, what you want to do is when you're having conversations with your mentees and when you notice things are going wrong, afterwards being able to reflect in the evening and being able to figure out what went wrong. Why was I not safe? Why was he or she not safe? How did that trigger us into chimp mode? How did that chimp interaction happening? And then what was happening in our conversations that was going either negative or positive? So please go and look at that a bit more. I'm not going to cover those two, a little bit of detail on that. And then for homework, therefore, you can either use that actual scenario you thought of earlier, or I'm going to give you a scenario. So imagine your unreliable slapdash mentee who missed a session last week with no excuse and now shows up 30 minutes late again today. So I want you to imagine what you would write down as your opening 1 or 2 sentences after you had greeted that person. You don't need to do this now, it's something you can reflect on. And I just want to show you the technique of what you're doing. So what you're doing is you're going to write down what you would think you would say. If you've had a scenario, you can actually write down what you did say, and then explain why you chose this approach. So if you want to make this really powerful, ideally explain it. So say you are in a scenario where you've got other people that's also interested in mentoring. You actually want to have a scenario where you can sit down and say, right, I had this mentee, and whether it worked well or didn't well, it didn't matter. This is what I did, and this is why I did it. And by explaining it, you're putting yourself in balcony view, and you're starting to have an understanding of what happens underneath the surface of those conversations. You're starting to understand how safety works and your ability to either make a mentee feel safer or unsafer, depending on what that scenario is. Great. So we're definitely going to have discussion time. What I wanted to do is get all this content across, which I hope I have done in the last hour, because I know some people at 6 o'clock, that's the button, right? Kids are screaming and my cockerel has been remarkably quiet. What I would love to do before some of you log off is I would love for you to put in the chat for me one thing you learned today that you feel will be useful in your practice as a mentor. If you also want the slides on these and you're not on my normal lists, then please put your email address. I would love to know who's around, so also put some details on there. And then those of you that want to have a bit of discussion, I'm going to open it for discussion in the next minute or so, and I would love to hear input or questions at that point. You can either put the questions in the chat or you can just put your hand up. But I would love to hear what you have learned from this hour. One of the challenges with Zoom is that one talks out into this great, well, I'm sitting out here looking out over Tinsa Bay, and one's not sure where things land and what is useful and yeah, what are the things we want to build on. Also, if you want to have comments in terms of where this is going to go into the future, please do. And then one last sort of announcement before we'll go into the discussion is that this little skills workshop is the beginning of a much larger vision of something called RAMP, the Rural Africa Mentorship Program, which we are officially now launching as the Rural Doctors Association of South Africa. The idea and the plan is to create a network of mentors across South Africa, Africa, of people who are passionate about mentoring and who is willing to offer support and mentoring of doctors newly arrived in rural health settings. At the moment, I need to figure out what such a structure will look like and some of the tools and skills and things, best practices out there. So I'm asking people to please join RAMP. And if you want to become one of our network, and at the moment you're not yet providing mentoring, I'm not asking you to take on any new KPAs. What I'm asking for people to be open for me to contact you through emails, through focus groups, etc., for ideas and best practices on mentoring any cadre in a rural health setting. And then next year, we're going to be running again a 6 weeks national rural onboarding program for all the new rural doctors. And then part of that we will create, looking at that afterwards, is can we start creating real living mentoring relationships across South Africa for new rural doctors. So that's our exciting baby that we are launching. And I'm looking for people to join us. So we'll be sending out the official invitations just to be on our database as a rural health, as if somebody passionate about mentoring doctors in rural health. You don't have to be in rural health. You can be in an academic institution. You can be looking after students. You can be in any cadre and of any level. But anybody who would love to be part of that conversation, we please invite you to join. And I'm just going to look at the chats here. Oh, thank you very much for all these. Gravely, I love the statements. Yeah, we don't say I can't say, we say I have not yet learned. I like that. Great, making people feel like they belong. A refocus on what students can bring. Yeah, we sometimes forget that because we've got so much we're supposed to. I like that. Do not arm wrestle with chimps. Yes. Great, thank you. I'll please add your emails. The chimp brain metaphor, very useful, also useful for your teenagers and your mothers and your partners. Great, yes, so you're talking about addiction, so very important, one of the important behaviors of how people bring down anxiety, and it's very difficult to deal with anxiety if you've not found safety with that chimp. 2-year-olds unfortunately have no sage. Viva RAMP, yay, yes. Chatting to our students, I enjoy that. It also makes your work more fun if you know who they are. Oh yeah, medical officers close to retirement, that's very challenging. You have to find some real tricks there and come and teach us. The 9 saboteurs are very fun if you enjoy that. The book is great. He's even got, if you go on the website on positive intelligence, he's got even like one of those questionnaires that you fill in, and then he sends you, it's like a free thing with a breakdown of your own personal saboteurs. That's always fun. I did those with my kids. Okay, great. Thank you very much for all the input. Officially now the theoretical part of the session is over. Does anybody like to comment or have any questions? We've had such a lot, and I will make available the YouTube video as well as the podcast. And also lastly, I'm very happy for this information to go everywhere. So I'm happy for you guys to use the slides and teach in your own facilities, use part of the slides, and really to try and build a new culture of mentoring and teaching on all levels and in all different cadres. Very quiet out there. Great. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to be on here for a couple of minutes doing any last bits of admin and saving chat sheets and things like that. We will continue with the WUSU Life in the Slow Lane. I assume the next ones there will be 2 sessions again in October. We'll keep you all posted. So thanks very much for Dylan Gibson. He's our family physician that's helping to set up these regular teaching sessions on all kinds of topics, and we'll get back to some clinical meat again in October. Good night, everybody. Have